Okay, thank you very much. And yes, welcome everyone. Today I'm going to give a very brief synopsis of spring vegetables. In the time I have, I definitely don't have time to cover all the vegetable options. So I encourage you at the end of the program or during the program, if you have specific questions about vegetables or topics I didn't cover, I'll be happy to address your questions. So for vegetable growing, first critical thing to know is where you are growing them. The timing, the correct time to plant as well as harvest vegetables is the first critical step in making sure you have gardening success. So of course, the United States is separated into different USDA hardiness zones, and this corresponds, of course, to the length of the growing season and the average last and first frost of the seasons. Now, I have a very extensive extension publication that covers the basics of many different vegetables that grow very well throughout New Mexico. And it's based on 3 different areas that are found in New Mexico based on the USDA hardiness zones. So if you're growing vegetables in the Farmington, Los Alamos, or Taos area, you're going to be in area 3. If you're in a slightly warmer part of the state there in the Santa Fe, Albuquerque area, that's area 2. And of course, down here in the south, where we have a longer warm season growing period, we're area 1. This is important to keep in mind because there's 3 different charts as part of the extension publication whose address is at the bottom of this slide. And I'll also provide this later in the talk. But look for your area. So if you're in the Farmington area and you're in New Mexico area 3, this chart gives you the most optimum planting window for the different vegetables. So let's see, I think on mine, the top is cut off, but you can kind of see we're getting into right now in April, and then of course in May, when we really want to start planting things. You can see that right now here in March, it's optimum to plant your onions or your peas or your spinach in your garden in the Farmington area. And that's really important. If you plant vegetables at the wrong time of the year, you're likely to get very poor quality if they grow for you at all. And I'll explain why a little bit more here in a few slides. So when you're planting, of course, here in New Mexico, we have tough soil. We also have to irrigate our vegetables. There's very few vegetable crops that we can grow without supplemental irrigation. So make sure when you're planting your plot that you have a nearby water source, a nearby ready water source that you can apply water to your garden when it's needed. Also think about what it is that you and your family like to eat. So when you're planting, of course, don't grow something that you are not going to enjoy. It's very important to keep written records as well. This goes into crop rotation. You always want to kind of mix up the types of vegetables that are in a certain part of your garden. That really helps break up diseases and pest issues. And also keep records about what did well, what particular varieties did great, what did you do that worked particularly well in your garden, and keep that book so you can build on your successes and learn from issues that you may have had and continue to increase your expertise in your gardens. Now, soil here in New Mexico is really tough. So I asked groups, who has perfect, loamy, beautiful, rich soil, and very, very few people ever say yes. Those few that do say that they have wonderful gardening soil, it's usually because it's been a long-term labor of love for them to year after year build up their soil organic matter by regular application of compost and manure. Most people are gardening either on a sandbox or very, very heavy clay. So keep in mind, no matter what soil you're starting with, through continued year after year incorporation of compost and organic matter, you can improve that soil. If you're anxious to start your garden and you don't have good soil, of course, you can do a raised bed or container gardens where you're purchasing your soil. And that's kind of, for me, it's a short-term answer while you're building your long-term, larger in-ground garden. So, of course, we must fertilize our vegetables, feed them with the proper nutrients that they need. There's 3 macronutrients that all vegetables need in different quantities. And if you purchase commercial fertilizer, you're going to have 3 numbers on that bag. The first corresponds to the amount of nitrogen, the second phosphorus, and the third potassium. Now, here in New Mexico, most of our soil is pretty high in potassium. It's always a good idea to get a soil test, though, so you do know exactly what's already in your soil and what's lacking. You don't want to overdose soil with a nutrient if already is plenty there for healthy vegetable growth. And of course, there's also many micronutrients such as calcium. Most of our soil in New Mexico has lots of calcium, silicon, magnesium, manganese. And if you're regularly incorporating manure and compost, you're probably very well covering these nutrients. The biggest issue we do get is if you have very, very heavy clay soil that can lock up nutrients. We also have very alkaline soil, which means a higher pH than neutral. And for that reason, we'll often see nutrient deficiencies such as iron deficiency. Iron is very locked up in alkaline soil. So even if you have iron in the soil, it may not be available for your plants. So we see this in trees as well as in some vegetables where you get iron chlorosis or yellowing appearance of the leaves. And that's just because the alkalinity is preventing that iron uptake. So fertilizer options, certainly you can use synthetic fertilizers like Miracle-Gro. This is like an immediate nutrient boost. Many home gardeners, though, prefer to use organic fertilizer options. So there are organic fertilizers you can purchase. Some of them they tend to be more expensive, though, and they tend to be lower in nutrients. So you're not quite getting the bang for your buck, but of course you're not using synthetic ingredients there. Compost is absolutely the best thing that you can add to your soil, whether it's sand or clay. It's going to help add the organic matter, maintain moisture retention of that soil, open it up for improved root growth, and really help turn that soil into a better growing media for vegetables. Compost may or may not have a lot of nutrients in it. It really depends on what the compost is made of, because you can make compost out of newspaper, so that would be very low in nutrients. You could also make compost out of animal manure, and that is really the ideal way to go. If you take animal manure and compost it, you have all the great nutrients that you get with animal manure, but through the composting process, you're also killing many of the weed seed and many of the disease agents that may be in that material that the cattle have consumed when they foraged. Green manure is another great way where you actually just grow a cover crop basically in your garden and then work it back into the soil just to build the health and nutritional content of the soil. And that's something a lot of hardcore organic gardeners and growers do. Now, for planting our garden, of course, direct seeding is very easy. You can put the seed out there. In that publication I mentioned, it will give you the distance and the depth that's ideal for the different vegetable seed. So I don't go into that in this talk, but there's a handy reference you can get online. Many gardeners, however, will start with transplants. This is when you actually grow the seed inside and then plant these seedlings out in your garden. So this is a great way to get a jump start on the growth of the vegetables. You can also avoid some of the early season pest and disease issues if you're using transplants. If seed is very expensive, of course, you're more guaranteed one plant per seed because a lot of the direct seeds are lost just to environmental pressures early in the season. Just be very careful if you grow your own transplants, or even if you purchase them, make sure you harden them off in a protected area outside for at least a week. And that's basically keep them watered, don't let them completely dry out. If it's going to freeze, bring them back inside. But you need to get them accustomed to outside environmental conditions before you transplant them into your garden, just so that they're not overly stressed. So, of course, water, we must water our vegetable gardens, but of course, we want to use our water wisely. It's a very precious resource here, particularly in the desert Southwest. Ideally, you want to water either in the early evening or early morning to reduce evaporation loss. And how often? Well, certainly when you direct seed, put seed out in your garden, or when you first put your transplants out in the garden, it's very important to keep those moist because they'll quickly die if they dry out too much. However, once the plants are established, you don't want to overwater or underwater. Overwatering can bring on diseases. Underwatering, of course, is going to stress the plants out, reduce your yield, and of course, possibly kill them. So that's just a few quick introductory slides. I know that you probably have full talks on soil, on irrigation. So what I'm really going to do is kind of touch upon some of the different vegetable options we have here in New Mexico, particularly in the northern part of the state. The first category of vegetables here is perennial vegetables. So perennial vegetables are those that once you plant them and establish them in your garden, they can give you a harvest for many, many years to come. So you put that work in the first year. After they're well established, then you can enjoy the fruits of your labor for many years after that. There's three basic types of perennial vegetables that are grown in New Mexico: artichokes, rhubarb, and asparagus. And keep in mind, with all of these, if you plant them, you need to make sure you're putting them in a place in your garden where they can stay for many years to come. So don't put them in some place you're planning to dig up in the next year or two. So having said this, artichokes will overwinter with a little bit of protection very well in southern New Mexico. In the northern part of the state, it gets a little bit too cold. So usually these plants will freeze out. And so you can't really grow these very successfully in the northern part of New Mexico. Rhubarb, however, it's a little bit too hot and unhospitable in the southern New Mexico, but in northern New Mexico, rhubarb is a great choice for a perennial vegetable crop. Of course, with rhubarb, you're just harvesting it for its stalks, and it really does do best if you have a very fertile garden soil that you're putting these plants into. Now, the one perennial vegetable crop that I will recommend for gardeners throughout the state is asparagus. Asparagus is a plant that is very tolerant to drought, salinity, heat, environmental stresses. So it does very well throughout the state. So I do have an extension bulletin just on how to plant asparagus. Usually you start asparagus through crowns, which are dormant root systems that are about 2 years old. You don't get a harvest the first year. The second year you can lightly harvest, but after that, they can be productive for 20 years or more. We have plots down here that I know have been productive for at least the 25 years that I've been at New Mexico State University. So the other classifications of vegetables I'm going to touch on are the warm versus cool season annual crops. So the warm season crops are those that are going to thrive during our warm summer months. The cool season crops are those that are going to prefer slightly cooler growing temperatures and will really suffer if we're trying to grow these during the hottest part of the summer. So you'll see in the planting list that the cool season crops have about a month jump for the most part on planting in northern New Mexico compared to the warm season crops. So the warm season are squash, tomatoes, eggplant, okra, cucumber, beans, chili, and bell peppers. The cool season crops that like slightly cooler temperatures include broccoli, carrots, spinach, lettuce, Swiss chard, kale, onions, beets, and radishes. So something to keep in mind with our warm season crops, if they're a fruiting type crop, and by fruit, I mean a bean is a fruit. I'm talking about, a tomato is a fruit, a chili pepper is a fruit, a melon, of course, is a fruit. These plants come in two different plant types, and this is very important to keep in mind when you plant your garden. We have determinate types, which are usually referred to as bush type, and we have indeterminate type plants that are usually referred to as vining or pole type. Now, with the bush types, I think we're all familiar with bush beans or bush tomatoes. These plants tend to have very early maturity compared to the indeterminate varieties. They tend to set all of their fruit at the same time, and they tend to take up very little space in your garden. So if you need to have a really quick time to pick your beans or pick your tomatoes, if you're growing a container garden or just have very limited space, look for the determinate or bush type varieties. Now, if you have lots of room, or many gardeners, most gardeners will prefer the indeterminate or vining pole types. These plants tend to set a few fruit periodically throughout the season. So you're going to extend your harvest. You'll pick a few tomatoes now. A few days later, you'll pick a few more tomatoes. And by the end of the season, the indeterminate type plants tend to give you a higher yield. But of course, with many of the indeterminate plants, you either need to be prepared to trellis them. Here's like a bean, the pole of beans here growing in this trellis. You may trellis them. If they're growing on the ground, like an indeterminate pumpkin or squash, they can take up huge areas in your garden. So make sure you have adequate room for these plants. So a warm season crop that we grow is sweet corn. This is an annual member of the grass family that's a monocot. So sweet corn is a great rotation crop to grow with most of our other vegetables that are dicots. Now, sweet corn has a relatively narrow harvest window, so you really want to plant sequentially early in the season to prolong the harvest later in the season. The harvest window is really important. You want to harvest when those silks coming up are brown and dry. And if you pop open a kernel, it has a milky fluid, or it's in the milk stage. If you wait too long with sweet corn, you quickly lose the sweetness, the enjoyable flavor that we grow sweet corn for. Now, keep in mind with sweet corn, it is wind pollinated. So it's very important that your corn plants are established in your garden so that they blow on each other, because they're blowing pollen, they're pollinating each other. If you don't have good pollination of your tassels, you're going to get poor pollination. So every one of those little kernels of corn has to actually have a pollen grain to start it. So for this reason, you don't want to plant your sweet corn in like one row north to south. You basically want to put them in short side-by-side 3x3, 4x4, or larger rows. And the pollen source affects the kernel quality. And this is unusual. Most vegetables, it doesn't really matter where the pollen came from. It's not going to affect the flavor or quality of the fruit that first season. It's more of a seed-saving concern. But with sweet corn, it will cross-pollinate. It will affect the flavor of that sweet corn. So if you have blue corn, if you have silage corn, if you have other types of corn, even other sweet corn varieties, can give you different flavor profiles to that sweet corn that you're growing. Here's just a few quick sweet corn varieties that have shown to do well in New Mexico. I'm not going to go into this in great detail because, once again, the extension publication that I mentioned has a long list of different varieties that have proven to work well throughout New Mexico. So how about our solanaceous crops? These are some of the favorite for home gardeners. That includes tomatoes, bell peppers, of course, chilies, a big favorite here in New Mexico, eggplant, and potatoes, which grow absolutely wonderfully in the Four Corners area. Of course, we grow these as annuals because they will freeze out at the end of the year. They're warm season crops, so they can't tolerate very cold freezing temperatures, especially the tomatoes and peppers, and eggplants are very sensitive to cold temperatures. So let's just, of this group, I'm going to talk about tomatoes a little bit more. This really is the most popular vegetable for home gardeners because of the just tremendous quality you get from a homegrown tomatoes versus something you can buy in a store. Now, these plants are self-fertile, and they do come in both the bush type or the vining type tomatoes. So plant accordingly if you want to harvest all your tomatoes at once versus harvesting a few tomatoes every few days. Now, one thing that's great about tomato plants, if you start out with a very leggy, long tomato transplant, you can actually plant this deep in your garden. So you can kind of see here where anywhere that stem is buried in the soil, you have new roots forming. They're called adventitious roots. And basically then, instead of having a floppy transplant here on top of the soil, you're going to actually establish a much deeper, more expansive root system in these plants to better support above ground growth. So this is a great thing to do. Just leave about a third of the plant above the soil and it will really thrive that way. If you're growing indeterminate tomatoes, just basically to control growth and for ease of harvest, it is recommended you prune them back somewhat. Now, you don't want to prune them too much here in New Mexico because those extra leaves do provide some shelter and protection from the developing fruit. But here's the classic pruning and staking method for indeterminate tomatoes or vining tomatoes. You want to leave two main stems, like so. And then you want to pinch off the suckers that grow between the leaves and the main stem. And the sucker are these little sprouts here that come out. And the problem with them is if you let them grow, they are going to just really grow basically another tomato plant on top of that first tomato plant. So you'll quickly end up with a very large bush of tomatoes, and it's harder to harvest the fruit and really tend to the plants. Take those suckers out before they get too big, because they are going to take nutrients and from the plant that we don't want to just throw away with the suckers. And it's also a good idea late in the season, if there's not enough time for green fruit that are forming to actually give you a red fruit before the freeze, it's a good idea to remove those late season flowers just so that the energy goes into ripening the fruit that are already on the plants. Now, we see disorders that we commonly see with tomatoes here in New Mexico and chili peppers and melons, and is blossom end rot. And that's when you get this very ugly scab there at the blossom end or the tip of the fruit. And that's usually caused by stresses while those fruit are first forming on the plants. So when your tomatoes are flowering or when your chili peppers are flowering and setting fruit like crazy, you want to try to minimize stress to those plants. So make sure you can't always control it. We can't control what Mother Nature does at all, but make sure you're at least giving them very even, regular watering. And in some cases with tomatoes in particular, some windbreak or partial shading can really take the stress off these plants. And if not prevent blossom end rot, greatly minimize it. So another disorder we see are splitting fruit with our tomatoes. With the melons, we also see this very often. And this is once the final mature skin has formed on our melons and our tomatoes, they can't expand very well to take in influxes of water. So it's important when your melons and your tomatoes are starting to ripen to back off on irrigation. Now, of course, we can't control Mother Nature, so she may bless us with a monsoonal rainflow right when our ripe tomatoes are out there. And that's when the fruit are going to split. And once you have splits in the skin, secondary pathogens come in and quickly rot those fruit. With melons, especially if you're growing heirloom, the delicious, wonderful heirloom type melons, they have not been bred for crack resistance or split resistance. So as soon as they turn ripe, they'll start splitting. It's really frustrating for many gardeners around the state. So just keep a real close eye. And as soon as they're mature, ready to harvest, you need to take them out of your garden. Another disorder that we can see on tomatoes, and of course other crops, is poor fruit set. So certainly if you have diseases or insect problems, the plants may stop setting fruit and they're just barely trying to survive. But with pollinating vegetables that need pollination to set their fruit, sweet corn that needs pollination to set their kernels, very low temperatures or very high temperatures will prevent pollination from occurring. It's just, it's outside the temperature range that pollination will actually occur. So we'll often see the plants just stop setting fruit under adverse temperature conditions. Another thing we see with tomatoes, though, is excessive nitrogen fertility. As I mentioned, nitrogen is like the key macronutrient that our plants need. But if tomatoes have too much nitrogen, they're going to grow very happily, vegetatively, putting on a lot of leaves, but they never switch into reproductive mode. So that usually is seen if you're growing tomatoes and applying Miracle-Gro or some synthetic fertilizer regularly. So the types of tomatoes that we have to choose from, of course, are our cherry tomatoes, the plum and small fruited size. The beefsteak or the big juicy slicing tomatoes that we have a really hard time in New Mexico growing without blossom end rot and other issues. Paste tomatoes have been bred for very high solids for cooking. And then, of course, we have the beautiful heirloom tomatoes that have really been brought forward because of the great flavor and quality, but they typically have no resistance to diseases or environmental stresses that can cause problems with production. So they can do great in good years, but if there's problems, they'll be the first to give us problems. So another warm season class of vegetables is the cucurbits. This includes our squash, pumpkins, gourds, cucumbers, and melons. They don't transplant well, so usually we prefer to direct seed these. However, if you have a shorter growing season, then it's definitely probably a good idea to, it's a good idea to go ahead and just start these as transplants. Just be very careful when you transplant these into your garden that you don't disturb the roots, because that will prevent transplant shock and help with establishment of these plants in your garden. So with squash, of course, these are warm season. They love the warm temperatures, the warm growing season. We have our summer squash that are actually harvested when the fruit are still immature. And we have our winter squashes that we allow to go to maturity, giving us the very hard outer shell or rind. And this allows for long periods of storage, well into the winter months. And of course, with winter squash, depending on the type you're growing, putting them through a curing process before you actually eat them can really help with the overall quality. And of course, with our squash, they can come in bush type, very more compact plants, or the indeterminate types that will sprawl in a very large area in your garden. Keep in mind with the cucurbit crops that most of these plants by far are monoecious. That just simply means that the plants bear separate male and female flowers. So with tomatoes or with chili peppers, they have perfect flowers. So both the male and female parts are in the same flower, so they will easily self-pollinate. But with cucurbits, since the flowers are separate, you must have some method of getting pollen from the male flower to the female flower. If you don't have pollinators at work, you will never have fruit, because an unpollinated female flower will just dry up and drop off the plant. So bees and other native insect pollinators are critical to actually get fruit set in our cucurbits and melon crops. So that's a quick synopsis of our warm season vegetables. Like I said, I barely touched on them. There's many other options, of course, that can be found in that extension publication I mentioned. Our cool season vegetables. Now, these are those that are either highly or somewhat frost tolerant. The seeds do tend to germinate when the soil is a little bit cooler. And often if you put these in soil that's too warm, it'll just sit there and not germinate. The cool season vegetables tend to have a more shallow root system. So in general, you need to irrigate these less deeply and more frequently. They tend to really have a good response to nitrogen and phosphorus application. And one disorder that we often see in cool season vegetables is bolting, or that's when these vegetables put up a seed stalk. And of course, if you've grown onions and they put up that seed stalk, you know that very quickly all those energy reserves in that onion bulb are used. So it kind of becomes mush quickly. So instead of us eating the onion, all the energy is going to the seed production instead. So of course, we don't want our cool season vegetables to bolt on us. Now, our allium family is one of the groups of cool season vegetables that includes onion, garlic, and leeks. These are another monocot crops. This is another crop that's great to rotate with many of the dicot vegetables we talked about. Onions are tolerant to frost and light freeze. Because of their shallow roots, they need to be watered more frequently, less deeply. And of course, they're not very competitive with weeds. So it's very important to control the weeds very good around the alliums in your garden. We know onions are really valued for their distinctive taste that comes from sulfur compounds they produce. And it's this fleshy basal plate that actually expands that we're actually eating. Now, one thing very critical about onions is depending on where you are gardening within the United States is going to dictate what type of onions you grow. So onions come in short day, intermediate day types, and long day. And if you're growing them in the wrong part of the country, you are not necessarily going to get bulbs forming. A big example, as you can see here, long day onions are adapted for the northern part of the country. If you want to try to grow a long day onion variety here in New Mexico, it's very possible that it's never going to give you a bulb. It will just look like a large leek. So short day onions, bulbing begins early. If they're planted in the north, they produce very, very small bulbs, such as the cocktail onions. Intermediate day onions are widely adapted, and they are perfect for northern New Mexico. The long day onions, if we try to grow them here in New Mexico at all, they may not form bulbs. So harvest is made through August, depending on what variety and whether you start with seeds or transplants. You harvest your onion when the leaves begin to turn yellow and lodge, and that basically means that the tissue there at the base of the leaves dies. The leaves will fall over flat onto the soil, and that's when you know that bulb is mature and ready to be harvested. And as I mentioned, you may have bolting issues. There are many bolting resistant varieties, or try different varieties if bolting is a problem with your onions. So lettuce, another very popular crop to plant in our gardens. It's a member of the sunflower family, which is another cool season group. There's 4 different types of lettuce. The crisp head is the classic iceberg lettuce. It has very tight heads, and it takes quite a long time to mature. The butterhead has more of the loosely filled heads. Butterhead lettuce does tend to wilt very quickly after you pick it, so it's another good one to grow in your garden where you can pick it and then immediately eat it. The loose leaf is really easy to grow. You can harvest the older leaves and let these plants regenerate. And the romaine or the cos or the elongated heads, and these are very late maturing, but very high yielding in many parts of New Mexico. So with your heading lettuce, you do want to plant in succession for prolonged harvest later in the season. The big issue we have with lettuce is bolting. And after lettuce bolts, it really becomes quite bitter, virtually inedible. So this is a field here in southern New Mexico where most of the field is bolting. As soon as it puts up that kind of Christmas tree shaped structure and starts to form flower buds, you know that lettuce is really unpalatable to eat at that point. And this does happen as our day length increases, as well as when our growing temperatures get regularly above 70 degrees. Our parsley family is another family of cool season crops that includes carrots. Of course, carrots come in a variety of colors. Orange used to always be the one we were always familiar with, but home gardeners as well as consumers are really embracing the wide variety of colors are now readily available in carrot cultivars. Since they are cool season vegetables, the best growth you get with carrots is between about 59 to 65 degrees. If temperatures are below 50 for prolonged periods of time, it may slow growth, it may decrease the color, but they'll usually bounce back fine. In New Mexico, really, it's the very high temperatures. If your carrots are still actively growing in your garden, when temperatures are above 70, above 80, that's when you start to get the very off flavors develop, as well as coarse root structure. With carrots, we do want to prepare our soil quite well before we plant. Of course, we'll direct seed our carrots typically. If you have very heavy or rocky soil, you can end up with very gnarly looking carrots. In addition, if you have a salt issue, especially if you've applied manure or fertilizer that's adding salt to your field, you can end up with very gnarly looking carrots like those pictured. And I always say, I actually grew the one on the left myself, and I had to take a picture of it. In my defense, it was a stray seed that had fallen a little bit out of my garden area, but boy, it really had a tough time trying to grow in the non-garden soil. So carrots are somewhat frost tolerant, so you can put a layer of organic mulch over them before the freezes come. And unless it gets really, really cold, they'll keep very well in your garden with that layer of a protective mulch. So you can continue to harvest them from your garden weeks after you actually get your first freeze. It's really the best place to store them. Here's a short list of cultivars. It's the Danvers is the classic orange carrot, but I always encourage gardeners to try some of the other more unique varieties, unique colors. The goosefoot family includes spinach, beets, and chard, another cool season loving family of vegetables. Of course, we know that this family has very nutritious vegetables. Spinach is well known for being very high in vitamins and minerals, a great addition to our diet. Spinach is tolerant to frost and light freeze. 55 to 65 is optimum for growth. And this is another group, because they're cool season vegetables, they tend to bolt, that is, put up seed stalks and develop bitter off flavors when they're maturing in hot weather, much above 70. You can harvest the older leaves and let the plants regenerate like you would with loose leaf lettuce. Here's a quick variety list, and the Savoy means the curly leaf type spinach. The non-Savoy type are the flat-leafed spinach. The mustard family. So this is the final family of vegetables I'll talk about, and this is a really, really important one. So the mustard group is also known as Brassica, cruciferous, or cole crops. This is another cool season group full of very nutritious choices, including broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, all the way to our radishes and the mustard greens, as well as the mustard weeds that we see very commonly growing throughout New Mexico. So to discuss broccoli, which is certainly one of the most popular of the brassicas, these are cool season annuals. They're tolerant to frost or light freeze. Broccoli is a little bit more sensitive to frost damage since we're growing it for the flower bud. But usually they're fairly tolerant to environmental stresses. Of course, this is a big flower bud, a big group of flower buds that we're actually going to eat. So of course we want to harvest these before those buds start opening and flowering. It's definitely with broccoli, you want to harvest it before it gets hot out. So you get the best quality when you're harvesting when the weather is still slightly cool, below 70 degrees. When it's above 70, up to 80, these plants develop very, very bitter flavors. So they very quickly become very unfun, untasty to eat. So definitely another classic cool season vegetable that we want to avoid growing these when it gets hot outside. So very low temperatures can cause chilling injury. Harvest them before when those buds are still firm. And you may get very, very small button heads if you're experiencing periods of temperature extremes, or if they're not getting enough nitrogen fertility. Here's a quick list of cultivars. And the seed companies are coming up with new ones all the time. And so here to conclude my talk, just a few rules of thumb. Certainly for success in your garden, you really need to be out there, watching what's happening, react to current events that are unfolding in your garden. If you see an insect coming in, if you see other issues, you want to react to it very quickly. And that's your best chance of getting things back under control in your garden. Of course, provide proper nutrition. Our vegetables need to be fed, so you need to have fertile soil that you're planting them in. Use great caution. I always advise try to not use pesticides and herbicides at all if you can avoid it. It really can cause problems, especially with pesticides. Usually gardeners will just end up killing the beneficial insects, and it's really the beneficial insects out there that are really keeping the insect pests in check. So I see this very often in commercial farms as well. They'll target a pest, they'll treat a pesticide, and then other pest issues really just take off because all the beneficial insects have been killed. And herbicides, the same thing. You can easily hurt your vegetable plants. So it's better to use some of the other non-chemical ways to control your weeds, but you do need to stay on top of them because weeds will outcompete your vegetables and really reduce the productivity in your garden. Now, use high quality seed. If you're going to save your own seed, we actually do talks on just seed saving. You can't just go out there and save seed from anything it's growing. There's things you need to know about that. Make sure your seed is kept in a cool place, whether you save it or purchase it, because heat will kill seed. And if the seed is not too many years old, it's usually going to give you a more vigorous plant. And the lifespan of different vegetable seed depends on the vegetable. Now, use varieties that do well in your area. Build on your own successes and ask your friends and neighbors, what varieties do best here. And as I mentioned at the beginning, plant at the correct time. That's really critical. So you don't try to grow things either in very hot temperatures or very cold temperatures where they're not going to be very beneficial to that particular vegetable. And after doing everything right, of course, harvest at the correct time so you can get the best flavor, the best nutritional value out of the vegetables. And I do have an extension publication online that just discusses the optimum time to harvest the different types of vegetables. If there's any, if you have not grown a vegetable before or are not certain. So here's the publication. Like I said, this has a wealth of information. I always encourage people that are growing vegetables. You can get many gardening books, but usually they've been written by somebody in Pennsylvania or Tennessee, places where they have very, very different conditions for growing vegetables than what we face here in New Mexico. So this is a free publication online that specifically addresses challenges and advice for growing vegetables here in New Mexico. We also have a complete list there if you want to learn how to grow asparagus, pumpkins, chili. There's many vegetable-specific extension publications, as well as how to take a soil test, how to irrigate, and anything else you may have questions on. And with that, hey, right at 45 minutes. All right, so now this leaves 15 minutes for questions. If anybody has questions about vegetables I didn't cover, or other topics you'd like to chat about.
That's great. Thank you, Stephanie. You do have some questions here in the chat box. One that was coming from BB. What area number is Gallup? This was towards the beginning of your presentation. Then you have 3 more from Emily.
Okay, yeah. So for Gallup, I have to check the map. I think you're zone 3. But what you can do is just do a quick web search and put USDA hardiness zone, Gallup, New Mexico, and it will tell you. And depending on your zone, so zone 3 corresponds to USDA hardiness zone 6A and 6B. If you're in USDA hardiness zone 7A or 7B, then you're zone 2. So I'm not sure. Gallup may be in zone 2, but I think it's in zone 3.
Okay, I hope that answers your question, BB. Stephanie, you have 3 more questions from Emily. Then some of them are kind of piling in as we speak.
Okay.
But I'm not sure if you want to go ahead and read them or I can read them for
Oh,
you.
yeah, no, if you don't mind reading them to me.
Okay.
I don't have the chat here handy.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
All right. Well, Emily's first question, and this was towards the beginning as well of your presentation. Doesn't it too much compost cause problems like it's supposed to be a 1-to-10 ratio?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. You don't want to just, in fact, I've heard some horror stories of these. You don't want to just dump too much compost out. You're typically going to add, only about 1 to 2 inches deep at the most in your garden. And I'm often asked, you can work it into your soil, or you can put it on the soil surface and kind of use it as a surface mulch, but don't just dump pounds and pounds of compost, because the plants are not going to grow if they're just trying to grow in compost. That's not good either. So you're absolutely right. Yeah, don't overdo it.
Okay, so another question from Emily: are cold season varieties even tolerant at those temps while they are germinating, sprouting, or only once they are established?
Yeah, so it depends. Some of the vegetable types will germinate at quite cool temperatures, but for the most part, as a rule of thumb, for the cool season vegetables, it's better to get them germinating, growing when it's slightly warmer out. So, yeah, oftentimes, the growth will slow at very cool temperatures. So you're absolutely right. You're going to have much better success if they're established before temperatures start dropping significantly.
Okay. And another final question from Emily: what if I have temperature swings which are 40 to 50 degrees? How do I decide when it's too hot or cold, since it can be both in the same day?
Yeah, boy, you are absolutely right. I can tell I'm talking to a very experienced gardener there. That's it's a huge challenge we have in New Mexico, because our temperatures are crazy. Our winds are crazy. So that's, oftentimes gardeners will have to replant if there was just a real unexpected temperature change. You can definitely get much farther if you're willing to put in the effort and the infrastructure to do some season extension, where you actually can have row covers to give some protection if you suddenly have a serious cold snap. And as I did mention, with heat, there's not too much we can do about heat, but you can really reduce the stresses on your plant if you do have the infrastructure and to give partial shading. And that's really hardcore tomato growers throughout the state have great success with partial shading just because the conditions are so stressful for tomatoes. But transplants can really help with that. If it's a vegetable that transplants very well, you can keep them inside in a protected area for as long as possible before you put them outside. And when they're a little bit older, they're a little bit more tolerant to those temperature swings and other issues that come up. But that and season extension, climate protection, infrastructure is the other way to go. And once again, watch. Some varieties are going to be a lot more delicate. Others will hold up better to those crazy conditions crazy varying conditions we have here in New Mexico.
Okay. Thanks, Emily, for those questions. I hope that answers them. You have another question from Stephanie. Is shade cloth necessary in full sun in, I believe that acronym is for Southern New Mexico, I'm assuming?
It's helpful. It's helpful for crops like tomatoes. And we actually have experiments going in just this season to try it on chili peppers as well. We know, one thing with chili peppers, for instance, we know that one of the reasons we have great flavorful chili peppers that's grown in New Mexico is because the high environmental stresses really cause the plants to produce protective chemicals that give it the pungency, the flavor. But we also know that's stressful in the plants. We do feel they may be more productive if some of that stress is alleviated through shading. So it's not necessary. We just can get better results with crops like tomatoes. Other crops, though, that really, thrive in the hot temperatures, like melons, they are better without shade, or better without that extra protection.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. And we have a question from Heather. Okay, that's a copy of the slide presentation. Okay. All right, Janie, can asparagus be grown in raised beds?
Yes, except one thing about asparagus, keep in mind that the longer those plants are in your garden, the more space they're going to take. So year after year, they're going to grow, they're going to keep expanding. So if it's in a raised bed, just keep in mind, if it's a small raised bed, they might outgrow it before they've actually gone through their whole life, their full 25-year plus life. So you may want to put them in a place where they can expand, but they'll love raised beds, just like most vegetables do, with that extra warmth they get. So it's a kind of a trade-off. Just be aware that they're going to outgrow that bed eventually.
Okay, I hope that, okay. She says thank you. Okay, so we have another one, Alyssa. When is the best month to start prepping our garden in Gallup? Also, what is the best way to grow raised beds, waffle style rows? Those are examples that she was asking.
So, to prepare it, really, if you really want to maximize the success of your vegetable garden, you can really keep it going, keep working it all year round, like putting in a cover crop in the fall, or basically keeping, incorporate your manure in the fall is really the best time to do it. So it has more time to break down the soil, especially if you're using fresh manure and non-composted manure. So you can really, to start this in the fall in preparation for spring planting, it works very well for Gallup as well as other places in New Mexico. And so the waffle garden, so the specific question is how to get your waffle garden set up. Am I remembering correctly?
Yes.
Yeah, waffle gardens they're wonderful. I mean, I love the whole concept of waffle gardens that have been, a great technique developed, many generations ago. And that's for those of you who aren't familiar with them, they're indented in the middle, kind of raised on the sides, so that any of the precious rain or moisture we get tends to go into the middle. And they're often grown in collaboration with the Three Sisters Garden, where we have that corn plant in the middle, the beans growing around it, and then the squash on the outside of those waffles. So really, I don't know of any quick way to prepare them except, by hand, by chilling and preparing them that way. But yeah, once you put them in place, though, it's a great technique for growing vegetables in the arid Southwest.
All right. So another question that just now rolled in is from Heather. Are there any fruits or veggies that the fresh seeds work well to plant?
Oh, sure. The fresh seeds, like right out of the fruit. Yeah, absolutely. So peppers, once peppers have reached their mature colors, if you're growing red chili, you can immediately plant the seed from red chili and it will grow. Same with tomatoes, as long as you remove the outer jelly layer on those seeds, because that layer is actually has chemicals that prevent seed germination. With winter squash, as long as it's a fully mature winter squash, you can plant those seeds right away, just not from the immature summer squash. And so yeah, I guess that would be the main one. Peppers, though, for sure, with red chili peppers, so you can plant those immediately, and we often do down here.
Okay, thank you. And Diane, what type of sweet corn works well in the Albuquerque area?
Oh, well, I gave you the short list of varieties. I know, most of the sweet corn varieties are hybrids. If you're trying to do an open pollinated heirloom type of sweet corn, Golden Bantam is one that I really like. I guess I'm a bit biased. I prefer to not grow hybrids that you can't save seed from them that's going to grow true. So Golden Bantam is the one I always recommend. It's not as high yielding. If you're looking for a high yielding sweet corn, then look for some of those hybrids that were listed. But if you're interested in preserving some of the heirloom types, yeah, Golden Bantam.
Okay, well, I hope that answers your question, Diane. If there are any more questions, feel free to insert them in the chat box, or you can go ahead and unmute yourself. We'll take one more question, then we'll go ahead and move on to our announcements. But a lot of thank you from our presenter from the crowd on here. They're saying thank you for this presentation. Very informative, and they appreciate it a lot for you answering their questions.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to chat with everyone tonight. Like I said, this was just a real quick overview. So I encourage everyone to get a copy of the publication, and certainly I know you'll have experts in soil and other aspects of this that are just absolutely critical to growing great vegetables. So thank you all very much. Have a good night.
Yeah, thank you. So
Thanks.
maybe we can go ahead and move on to our announcements. But thank you, Stephanie, for
Sure.
taking time out of your schedule to provide this presentation for us. We really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thanks, and good night.
Good night. And so we'll go ahead and move on to our announcement that will conclude our tonight's webinar. But just to let you guys know that I have released a poll, and let me see if I can go ahead and get that shared right here. Let's see. All right. Okay, so like I mentioned, I did release a poll for you guys. If I could take a minute from your time to have you guys answer that survey poll for us, I would really appreciate it. It's just getting a good understanding from the before and after the webinar. What do you think about it before? Where your thoughts at on vegetable gardening? And after the presentation that was provided by Dr. Walker, where is that information heading now? So if you guys wouldn't mind taking that survey, I would really appreciate it. It helps us on our end as well. But what you see on here on the slide is a beef nutrition webinar that will take place next week on the 29th, starting at 5:30 p.m. through 6:30. And this will be presented by the New Mexico beef consultant. Her name is Kate. She'll be covering current projects, partners, as well as review beef nutrition facts and research. And it will also tie into one of the webinars that will be given in April, which is beef cuts. So that's going to be offered by another New Mexico beef consultant. So these two will tie in together. So if you guys want to stay tuned in next week's, this is already released on our website at nsa.nmsu.edu. So you guys can go ahead and register for that event as well. And we'll also share this information on our Facebook page, just to let you guys know that this is the webinar that will be happening next week. And moving on. So for this one, this goes out to all of my livestock owners who would like to partake in a livestock first aid training that will take place on April 27th from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. The location is at Dene College campus in Crown Point, New Mexico. So for those that are on here, if you're local around Crown Point, and if you guys want to tune in, this is going to be very interesting. So producers will have the basic knowledge of how to use the first aid kit. You see the first aid kit right here. So we gathered a first aid kit, a lot of materials to put in it. So like prolapse needle, you got OB sleeves and OB loops for calvings. And if you want to partake in this, it's on this date, April 27th. We'll be sharing that on our Facebook page as well. So this will have you get a good knowledge of how to use that first aid kit to treat wounds. So we'll go over injection sites for cattle, sheep, horses, to discussing the types of vaccines, dewormings, how to develop a schedule for vaccine and deworming for all those three species. So this presentation will be presented by Dr. Wenzel. So that he's coming from New Mexico State University as well. He's the NMSU veterinarian specialist, I guess you could say. But that is for announcements today. So let's see, moving forward, those of you that are new on here, and I do see a lot of people that are new, here's our main platform. So if you have any sort of interest in such as farming, we do have some upcoming events located on our website. So if you take a picture of that, this screen right now, and just type the nsa.nmsu.edu in your URL box, and it'll bring you straight here. And this is our main page, what it should pop up. And I'll have all the tabs here, who we are, meet the team, and conservation planning program, and our webinar and workshops. This is where all the presenters' presentation slides will come up. So under webinar and workshops. Like I said, this session is being recorded, so it will be posted next week. So moving on, we have our conservation planning program. So we provide a conservation planning program that we have partnered with Dene College Land Grant Office. This program is available for all farmers and ranchers who need to complete their conservation plan in Eastern and Northern agencies. So this is free of charge. So if you know anyone who needs assistance in like trying to develop a conservation plan for completing a requirement under like the BIA, please have them contact us at nsaproject@nmsu.edu. So we're here to help you guys out. We also provide the conservation planning workshops. So if that's something that's interested in you guys, So feel free to go ahead and email us. And like I said, the slide before that, if you head over to our conservation planning program tab right here, that's going to pop up on the main screen. It will show you the request forms that you guys would have to fill out. But other than that, thank you all for joining us this evening. I see a lot of new faces on here, so thank you for coming on. We appreciate having you guys. So like I said, follow us on Facebook. We have a YouTube channel where all of our webinars recorded and posted. We have monthly newsletters. If you need to get in contact with Jesse or I, our contact information is right there, as well as our Facebook and no, not Facebook page. Well, of course, Facebook page is on there in our website. But other than that, thank you all for joining us, and I'll end it here. Everyone, my name is Mikkel Lantana. I am the Navajo Sustainable Agriculture Field Specialist. In short, we call it the NSA project. For those of you that are still unmuted, I would ask for you to unmute yourself by chance. So we are funded by the USDA Outreach and Assistance for Native Farmers and Ranchers, and we are part of the New Mexico State University Cooperative Extension Service. So what you see on here is who we are funded by and who we are part of the NMCES. And here we collaborate with our two main project partners is the Dene College Land Grant Office and COPE, which stands for Community Outreach and Patient Empowerment. So to moving on, so going straight into our goals of the NSA project is mainly to help producers improve their operations, profitability, and sustainability through our educational programs and technical assistance in McKinley and San Juan and Cibola counties. So to kind of expand on the educational programs aspect, we provide like weekly webinars and presentations like this. So we alternate topics each week from farming to livestock, back to farming, etc. So we also host a lot of, well, not a lot, but we're kind of getting into the mix of it right now since the COVID's been lifted. So we host in-person workshops with our main project partners, like I mentioned, from Dene College Land Grant Office, as well as COPE. From soil surveying to herd health and conservation planning that we have offered last year, and as well as a USDA resource fair gathering local field reps to share local programs such as NRCS, FSA, Risk Management Agency, Rural Development that we have a lot of those field reps from in the counties that I just named. We host a USDA resource fair every year through webinar base for them to share a lot about their programs and what there is to offer, as this will help increase our Navajo farmers and ranchers' knowledge in accessing these available programs. And through our gardening programs as well, we increase the local production and consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables and healthy food